I'm Judd Myers.
I'm Scott Tipton.
Welcome to Blastoff. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Blastoff podcast. I'm your host, Judd Myers, here with another one of our home shows. And this one is kind of special, very personal, with both Scott and I telling stories that really kind of hit us where we live. First up, in Comics 101, Scott tells the tale of how he met his friend and mentor, Marvelous Mark Gruenwald. And then in ReTales, I talk about funny books. Let's get to it. The history of comic books, the characters you love, and the people who created them. This is Scott Tipton's Comics 101.
It's time once more for another trip in the Wayback Machine, this time to the year 1987. Teenage Scott is on the way out the door to class one morning when the phone rings. My mother picks it up, speaks for a minute, and then hands me the receiver. "Phone for you, it's Mark," she says. And I assume she means Mark, a friend of mine from school. An unfamiliar voice begins. "Scott, this is Mark Gruenwald. I'm an editor at Marvel Comics." I didn't need the explanation. At the time, Gruenwald was editing most of my favorite comics, including all 3 Avengers series, as well as writing Captain America, which was in the middle of what was, for me, the best storyline the series had seen in years. But why the hell would Gruenwald at his Marvel office in New York be calling my parents' house in California? Confession time. Back in the day, when I was just a fledgling teenage fanboy, I was a full-on comic book letter hack, with fan letters appearing in the letters pages of all kinds of Marvel and DC books. The morbidly curious among you can look in late 80s issues of comics like Avengers, West Coast Avengers, Captain America, Hulk, Flash, Secret Origins, and many others for examples of my far from deathless young prose. Hey, Mark, what's up? I kind of mumbled. "So, we just got your letter about the Hawkeye series, and I just wanted you to know that I've got Mark Bright in my office right now, and he's redrawing the art for the next issue, putting notches on all the arrows." I could hear the sound of laughter in the background. Notches on the... And then I remembered. I had just written a letter to the Solo Avengers letter column, and in it I'd been a wise ass about the fact that Hawkeye must be having some difficulty firing his arrows since there were no nocks at the ends of the shafts for the bowstring to rest in. Now cut me some slack, this is what passes for cleverness when you're 16 years old. And in my defense, artist Mark Bright used to draw these arrows really large in the panels. It was like Hawkeye was firing bowling pins, and you couldn't miss the fact that there was no notch in the back for Hawkeye to knock the arrow. Gruenwald and I chatted about Marvel Comics for a few more minutes, and then, before I knew it, the call was over. I really don't remember much of what else was said that day, to be honest. I was just so stunned to be getting a call at my house from Marvel over something so petty as Hawkeye's arrows. And I'm sure that's why Gruenwald made the call. Based on what I know about him from our many subsequent conversations, as well as everything I've read, the sheer randomness of such a phone call no doubt appealed to his wicked sense of humor. This was how I first met Mark, the man who would become for me the face of Marvel Comics. I would get to know him better over the years through continued correspondence and our annual meetings at conventions until his tragic and far too early death in 1996. With your indulgence, we're going to go long and break format a little so I can share a few facts, stories, and recollections about a good man gone too soon. Marvelous Mark Gruenwald. Born June 18th, 1953 in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, Mark Gruenwald fell in love with comics at an early age, buying most of the early Marvels off the rack when they were first published, and forming an affection for Gardner Fox's Justice League of America that would continue throughout his life, showing itself most prominently in his acclaimed work Squadron Supreme. More on that later. Mark graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh in 1975, with, naturally enough, a degree in art and literature. He put together a portfolio and set off for a visit to New York to break into comics. And after being rebuffed by Marvel and DC, Gruenwald decided that the only way to make this happen was to pick up and move to New York, with no job and no prospects. Not so coincidentally, I did the same thing after college. moving to LA to build a career with 0 leads and no job prospects, a move much inspired by Mark's. Worked out pretty well for me too. Taking work as a file clerk in a bank to pay the bills, Mark and fellow comic superfan Dean Mullaney began publishing a fanzine called Omniverse, which explored the notion of reality and continuity in comics, and which Mark hoped would show off his writing, editing, and design skills. Clearly the plan worked, as in 1978, Mark was hired by Marvel's then new editor-in-chief Jim Shooter as an assistant editor at Marvel. Mark rose through the ranks quickly, becoming a full editor on books like Avengers, West Coast Avengers, Iron Man, Spider-Woman, and many others. After thriving in that position for many years, Mark was later promoted to executive editor in 1988, a post he held for several years, before finally being promoted to editor-in-chief of the Marvel Heroes line in 1995, at a time when Marvel divided its publishing output into 5 separate imprints, with each group having their own editor-in-chief. But for most of this time, Mark was Marvel's resident continuity cop, acting as the primary in-house source for information, history, and current status for all Marvel's characters. This no doubt led him in 1982 to create, edit, and co-write the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, an exhaustively researched reference series that listed all of Marvel's characters, concepts, locations, and technology, all from A to Z. Starkly designed and with limited illustrations, conventional wisdom was that a primarily prose magazine with no story and no action would fail spectacularly on the shelves. But Mark knew better. He knew that this kind of obsessive attention to detail and strict adherence to a sense of reality was what the fans wanted. After all, Mark was the biggest fan of them all. Together with collaborators Peter Sanderson and Elliot R. Brown, Mark produced a remarkably complete, intricately detailed volume of reference. Literally thousands of pages of backstory, history, pseudoscience, and diagrams that explained and clarified the Marvel Universe to the tiniest degree, without ever limiting it for future stories. Over 30 years later, these books are still used by comics professionals as reference material, and complete sets remain a hot commodity on the convention circuit. Mark was also active creatively throughout his time at Marvel, writing such books as Marvel 2-in-1, Hawkeye, DP7, Squadron Supreme, and a lengthy world record run on Captain America, spanning some 136 issues, over 10 years on the series. We'll talk some more about Mark's fine writing in a bit, but it's his work as an editor that had the most impact on me personally. From the outside looking in, it's impossible to realize what makes an editor good at his job. All I knew was that I tended to enjoy the books he edited more than the rest of Marvel's line. And more than that, Mark, having been a fan himself, realized that part of his job as editor was to connect with fans, get them excited about comics, and more important, get them excited about Marvel. For Mark, the best way to go about this was through the comic conventions, where he would go out of his way to transform the traditionally stodgy panels and discussions into things far more fun and memorable. I remember one year at WonderCon in Oakland attending what was listed as a Marvel Q&A panel. This was back when Marvel still attended the smaller conventions, a move which I think works miracles for creating lifelong fans. As Mark came out to greet the crowd, he was holding a brown paper sack. Questions would be asked and answered, Mark revealed, but the only way to ask a question was to first receive the bun of inquisition. Mark then dramatically reached into the bag and slowly withdrew a bran muffin, much to the excited gasps and murmurs of the audience. Mark then proceeded to huck that muffin around the room for the next hour and a half, hurling it in turn at each potential questioner who would need to pluck the slowly disintegrating muffin from the air in order to ask their question. I think it was 2 or 3 questions after I had thrown it back that the muffin finally disintegrated in midair, with a dejected crowd moaning at the sight, only to break into a wall-shaking roar when Mark reached back into the sack and thrust a second muffin into the air, like pulling Excalibur from the stone. It seems like such a small thing, but I've never seen a crowd leave a panel in a better mood in all my years at the conventions. Another year, Mark held a Marvel trivia contest, only with a catch. It would be multiple choice mob trivia. All the chairs were cleared away, and designated areas on the floor were listed as A, B, and C. With each question, contestants would run to the spot on the floor where they thought the correct answer was. It sounds like a horrible, dangerous idea, I know, but Mark trusted the fans to take care of each other. And what followed was one of the funniest trivia contests I've ever seen, with crowds of fans running like chickens with their heads cut off to get to where they thought the right answer was. Even the more routine panels just about what was happening in the Marvel books were a lot more exciting with Mark in charge. Before the panel began, while the crowd was still filling the seats, Mark would get out on stage and do this bizarre maneuver where he would stomp on the wooden stage floor over and over and over and over with his elbows jutting out at an odd angle, and this insanely loud stomping noise getting the crowd more and more fired up until soon they too were clapping and stomping and worked into an absolute frenzy. And by the time the guests were announced, it just didn't matter who was coming out. It could have been a letterer on Power Pack, and the crowd would have roared as if Stan Lee and Jack Kirby just flew in on their jetpacks. In comparison, the DC panels at the time were mind-numbingly dull affairs, with one or two DC editors clicking through an endless slideshow of images and covers. Mark just made conventions fun. It was after Mark's surprise call to the house that we got to know each other better. As the following year at WonderCon, I was looking through the preview issues at the Marvel table when Mark approached, spying the name on my badge. "Hey, still checking the arrows?" It was also clear he knew who I was past that phone call, as he mentioned characters and stories I liked and disliked, and had written to him about in numerous letters, some of which have been printed, and some not. Every year after that, Mark and I would meet at WonderCon and discuss the previous year's books, what I liked, what I hadn't, the things he thought had worked, and the things he thought could have been improved. Mark would without fail hassle me for my favorite characters, always refusing my requests for a team-up between Yellow Jacket and Stegron the Dinosaur Man. One year, I stopped by the Marvel booth, and Mark was immediately on the attack. "Hey, did you buy your Ant-Man comics yet?" Only to mine being outdrawn, gunfight style, when I pulled a Silver Age Tales to Astonish out of my bag, which I'd purchased only moments before. Our annual meetings continued through my college years, as I'd make the trip from Santa Barbara to Oakland every spring for the WonderCon. When graduation neared, I wrote to Mark and asked how the employment outlook was there for an assistant editor's position. Mark replied with the blunt but honest truth: business was bad. This was just as the comics investors market had collapsed. They were in the middle of layoffs, and he wasn't even that confident about his own position. He gave me his office number, and we talked about it some more on the phone. Mark tried to be positive about possibilities down the road, but it was clear Marvel would not be doing any hiring anytime soon. When Marvel reorganized after the bankruptcy, giving up their separate imprint structure, and Mark was passed over as editor-in-chief, I thought and hoped that he'd head over to DC, where his old assistant Mike Carlin was then currently in charge, and where he'd get the chance to finally work on so many characters he'd never had the opportunity to write. Instead, Gruenwald and Carlin wound up working together on a project literally decades in the making, DC vs. Marvel, a miniseries that would pit all of Marvel and DC's heavy hitters against each other, with the fans voting to decide the outcomes. Just as DC vs. Marvel was hitting the stands, tragedy struck, with Mark's shocking and unexpected death from a heart attack at the age of 43. To be completely honest, a big part of my desire to work in comics died with him. I had planned on waiting a couple years for Marvel to get back on its feet and approach Mark again with some work experience under my belt. But I honestly lost all desire to do so after the news of Mark's passing. In my mind, after years of conversations, meetings, and correspondence, Mark Gruenwald was Marvel Comics. With him gone, it just didn't feel the same. Mark had a special request that some of you might have heard about. He requested that his body be cremated, and the ashes blended with the printer's ink used in the production of a comic book. Mark's widow Catherine and Marvel carried out the request, and in 1997, a trade paperback collection of Mark's critically acclaimed Squadron Supreme series was published, with the ink containing, as his wife put it in the book's foreword, actual particles of the Gru. Although some found the request odd or macabre, I thought it perfectly in character, reflecting both his love of comics and his often completely chaotic and unpredictable sense of humor. The summer following his death, a memorial panel was held at the San Diego Comic-Con for Mark Gruenwald. It was a packed room, with probably a couple hundred people in attendance, and many of Mark's friends and fans getting up to speak. I'm pretty sure I told the phone call story. I think it was Marvel editor and writer Tom DeFalco who told the story of the time he was flying back from a convention with Mark, and as he was going through security, noticed everyone growing very nervous and looking at him strangely. He looked up at the x-ray screen and saw the perfect outline of a handgun appearing in his luggage. Naturally, he was pulled aside and his luggage searched, only to find a piece of cardboard cut into the shape of a pistol wrapped in aluminum foil, tucked between two of his shirts. Sensing that he'd been the victim of a practical joke, airport police let DeFalco go, who soon met up with a smirking Gruenwald, long gone through security. Mark's widow Catherine brought us all a gift that day. Video footage taken of Mark from his years at Marvel and from a local access sketch comedy TV show that Mark and a few of his Marvel cohorts did for a couple of years. We all got to see Mark one more time, see some of his legendary office stunts like the time he filled the office with crumpled paper floor to ceiling, or how he built a 3-foot-tall platform beneath his desk and chair so that he towered over all who entered. We got to see his equally famous quirks, like his insistence that absolutely nothing be left on the surface of one's desk. Even the telephone was tucked away in a desk drawer. Mostly, we all just got to see Mark again. As we got ready to leave the panel that day, Catherine had a favor to ask. We'd all seen on the video this odd, silly walk that Mark would do from time to time just to get some easy laughs. A kind of mix of a laid-back saunter and a John Cleese-style high step. She thought Mark would like it if we would all walk out of the room that way and not tell any of the people waiting to come in for the next panel why we were doing it. Sure enough, about 200 people came lurching out of that room one at a time, and not a word was said. Catherine passed out to all of us that day a list of life lessons that Mark had written for his column in Marvel Age magazine. And looking through it now, Mark's lesson number 168 strikes a bittersweet note. Someday, Mark wrote, the universe will tire of me and will break me down into the components I came from. Right now, I'd mind if that happened, but when the time comes, I imagine I will welcome no longer being separate from the rest of reality. That may be, but the rest of us are all the poorer for it. Not all great stories happen in the pages of a comic book. Some of them happen in the store. Welcome to Judd Meyer's ReTales.
They breezed in one Sunday afternoon, wide-eyed and cheerful. Both must have been in their late 70s or early 80s. I watched as they casually walked the floor, browsing and whispering to one another. The one thing that immediately struck me was that they were holding each other's hands. I remember thinking about how lucky it must be to get to that stage of life and not only be with someone you love, but also to want to hold their hand. She wore a crazy purple hat with a wide brim. It would have looked silly on a younger woman, but somehow it suited her just fine. He wore beat-up jeans and a button-up shirt, not tucked in, loose and wrinkled. She dropped her bag and he bent to pick it up. He handed it to her and she gave him a sweet little kiss on the cheek. Again, I thought, lucky. They made their way into the kids section and stopped short at the spinner rack. We've always kept an old-fashioned spinner rack in the window, stuffed with all manner of kids' comics. We keep it all mixed up so the kids have to hunt for what they're looking for. The hunt is what's missing these days. She spun it around and laughed the whole time. He watched her and lit up right along. After a while, they came to the counter and plopped down a stack of comics. Archie, Betty and Veronica, Jughead. Did you find everything you were looking for? I asked. Well, I wasn't really looking for anything, she said, but I sure found something. I wasn't aware they still made these. Well, why wouldn't they? I said. She paused for a moment, then threw her head back and laughed. It was a hearty laugh that didn't befit her age. If you closed your eyes, you'd think she was a woman in her 20s. Are you the owner? She asked. I sure am. We exchanged pleasantries. Her name was Rose. His was Ben. They lived just a few blocks away and had done for the last 20 years. They took the same walk up and down the boulevard every Sunday for most of those 20 years and were surprised to see a new store open in our location, much less a comic book store. I welcomed them to the shop, and they welcomed me to the neighborhood. They came every Sunday like clockwork, same time every week, same youthful exuberance. Rose wore a new hat, each one more colorful than the last. red to suit her name, yellow, green, pink, lavender. Ben wore his usual jeans and sneakers, sprightly and tough for a guy his age. Every week they made their way to the kids section, raiding my spinner rack for everything Archie. The conversation was always wonderful. They'd just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. 50 years. They met during the Golden Age. What a time that must have been. She spoke of comics back then, and we quipped about the usual fortunes everyone would have made had they all kept their comics instead of tossing them away like newspapers. Ben said, "Back then we called them funny books. We rolled them up and stuck them in our back pockets. It was a different time. We didn't know about how to collect things and take care of them. I mean, really take care of them. When you're that age, you don't think about the future and what things will be worth. You've got all the time in the world to figure that out." I replied, "But you sure did have a lot of fun reading them, didn't you? Having fun is all that counts in the world of comics." Again, Rose's laughter filled the shop. I began to realize that Ben only laughed when she did. When she looked forlorn, which was a rare event, his mood followed. He shouted her, physically and emotionally. All I could think about was how lucky their grandchildren were to have these two spry old folks pelting them with Archie comics every week. It made me want to call my grandmother. So I did. We started placing large reorders of Archies. Heck, we'd never ordered that many before, but Rose was eating them up on a weekly basis, and I had to keep up with her. I suspect Ben had the same problem. They came in on a Sunday, as usual. Only this time they came in a bit later in the day than their normal visit, and the mood was altogether different. Rose still wore her signature bright and outrageous hat. Ben still looked beat up and worn out. But I noticed his hand on her arm. I noticed how she seemed to be almost leaning on him. We exchanged our hellos and how are yous, and they took up their place where the comic books spin. They stood there for a long, long time, long enough to make me wonder. They came to the register, and Rose set down her usual booty. I stared at her and made no move to ring her up or make polite conversation. It was rude and presumptuous, but I did it anyway. She knew right away what I was thinking and winked at me. There's something wonderful about being on the receiving end of a wink from a colorful old woman. Makes you feel like your entire life has been lived correctly, like you made the right choices and she's the only one who knows. She reached up and gently pulled the hat from her head, letting it slide onto the counter. The tufts of hair were few and far between. The rest was bald, and not by choice. The cancer was doing its work, and doing it well. "Oh, Rose, I'm so sorry. If there's anything I can do, please let me know," I said sheepishly. Rose put her hand on mine and said, "Sweetie, you're already doing it. Now ring me up for these Betty and Veronicas. I need to get home and see who wins this time." The following week, Rose seemed 1,000 times better. She was bright and chipper and wore a rainbow-colored scarf instead of her signature hat. Ben, however, wore a brand new baseball hat. It was out of character and oddly humorous. They brought their books to the counter, and I began to ring them up. "How are you feeling today, Rose?" I asked. "Feeling great. How about you?" she replied. "Not bad for a Sunday." "How you doing, Ben?" I said. Ben took his hat off and smiled. "Bald," he said. "Damn bald." 80 years old, and he'd shaved his head in solidarity. This was dedication on a grand scale. This was bravery beyond borders. This was love. 6 weeks passed. The Archies piled up. Ben came in alone one Sunday. He wore no hat and made no pretense of his bald pate. I unashamedly left the customers I was helping to greet him. "Hey, Ben, how's Rose doing?" I asked. He replied, "Not so good, kiddo. She took a turn and couldn't shake it this time. She's tough, though. She'll fight it off." He didn't seem to want to talk about it anymore, so I didn't push. He grabbed all that he could from the spinner and brought it to the counter. "Do you have any more?" he asked. "Sure," I said. How many more issues do you need?" "Every one you've got," he said. I realized then that I had no idea what their lives were about, that I had no place in imagining I knew these people and what their life was like outside of my doors. The Archies and Betty and Veronicas and Jugheads that she piled up on the counter weren't for her grandchildren at all. Hell, they'd be grown by now. They were for her. It's not the cover that counts. It's the stories inside. Ben told me they were the only things she could focus on, that besides their Sunday walks, she hadn't really gone out in almost a year, that during the times of the most savage pain, she held the comics in her hands because they comforted her. He told me that he read to her at night from them. From Archie Digest, a bald old man acting out all of the roles and finishing every punchline. I can only imagine how much joy that gave her amid her anguish. He cried a little at the counter till he realized people were looking. "Just ring me up," he said. "Not today, Ben," I said. I bagged all the books up and passed my hand over the register. "Today they're on me." He shook my hand hard, thanked me, and he left. I never saw either of them again. Lots of things happen inside a comic book store, especially a small one. You get to see more, and you get to see it up close and personal. People come in, and you become immersed in their lives, or at least what little you really know of them. It's all a moment in time, as if they bring in pieces of the outside world, but not all of it. The rest is manufactured and made real by the time you ring them up. If you pay attention to people, you see all of their truths, all of their strengths and weaknesses, or you go blind, and they become whatever you imagine them to be. I imagine Rose holding out for a while longer, then passing peacefully away. I imagine Ben tying up loose ends, then joining her not long after. I imagine their family going through their boxes of their things, a lifetime of personal treasures, treasures collected, treasures taken care of. And at the bottom of one, a tremendous stack of Archies and Betty and Veronicas and Jugheads, all well read and enjoyed, all filled with memories of a golden age, when they were both young and scared and had all the time in the world. The Blastoff podcast is produced by The Colonel, Jeff Fox, Scott Tipton, and me. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Anthony Gray. You can find more of his musical compositions on his website, DerekAnthonyGray.com.
For more information about anything you've heard us talk about today, check us out online at BlastoffComics.com. We have an active Facebook presence, so check us out over there on Facebook. And you can reach us on Twitter at BlastoffComics or on Instagram.
Or you can come by our retail location in North Hollywood in the heart of the Arts District, 5118 Lankershim Boulevard in North Hollywood, just 2 blocks south of Magnolia. See you soon.